The first signs of their arrival were not seen in the skies but felt in the pit of the stomach. Sensors on satellites caught distortions, shadows where light should have traveled freely, and then the blackened silhouettes of vessels large enough to eclipse cities. Humanity had always feared that first contact would be ambiguous, diplomatic, perhaps even hopeful. Instead, the truth arrived with no words, no parley, no declaration. It came with fire. The invaders descended like an executioner's blade. Their technology was beyond anything the brightest human minds could have conceived. Orbital beams lanced through the atmosphere, boiling seas and cracking earth. Cities fell in moments, reduced to ash heaps where skyscrapers once pierced the clouds. Entire power grids collapsed under the assault of directed energy pulses that fried circuits like dry leaves in a furnace. Militaries, built for human versus human conflict, found themselves impotent against weapons that sliced tanks in half and swatted aircraft from the sky as if they were gnats. These beings did not come to enslave. There was no pretense of conquest, no attempt to claim territory. They came for only one purpose: to kill. Their philosophy, glimpsed in fragmented transmissions, was chilling in its clarity. Humanity was labeled an infestation, a species unworthy of coexistence. To them, Earth was not a planet to govern but a nest to be burned out. They had done this before, on worlds farther from the galactic core, and they would do it again here. Panic gripped the globe with merciless speed. Within days, financial systems collapsed, governments fractured, and communication lines drowned in desperate calls for help that never came. Refugees clogged every highway, pushing carts of possessions that meant nothing against the weight of extinction. Children cried in the arms of parents who could promise nothing but a little more time. Leaders gave speeches, their voices trembling beneath practiced tones of calm, knowing that their militaries had already been reduced to ruins. Humanity had always believed in preparation, yet no preparation had been made for this. Nuclear deterrence, the ultimate card in human arsenals, proved worthless when enemy shields bent and dispersed radiation like harmless mist. Aircraft carriers, symbols of centuries of naval dominance, were reduced to flaming husks before their aircraft could launch. The world's finest fighter jets scrambled in vain, their missiles fizzling against shimmering fields of alien defense. Entire armies died without ever glimpsing the faces of their killers. And what faces they had! Those few who survived ground encounters spoke of creatures tall and angular, their forms encased in armor that seemed grown rather than forged. Their limbs moved with mechanical precision, but their voices, if they could be called voices, rasped with tones that clawed at the human psyche. No empathy flickered in their movements. No hesitation marred their attacks. They were predators perfected by eons of extermination, and humanity was merely their next culling. Despair took root as firmly as the invaders' landing craft. In every corner of the world, humans whispered of the end. Religious leaders declared judgment, philosophers mumbled about inevitability, and cynics muttered that the species had finally met something it could not outthink, outfight, or outlast. It seemed impossible to imagine a path beyond survival for a few scattered remnants, clinging to tunnels and ruins like rats hiding from the torch. Yet beneath the despair, something else began to stir. In the shadows of ruined cities, men and women who had lost everything refused to lie down. Their families were ash, their nations crumbled, but their instinct to resist burned unquenched. Small groups gathered, not governments or armies, but ordinary survivors. A mechanic who once fixed buses stood shoulder to shoulder with a soldier who had watched his battalion destroyed. A farmer carried the same rifle as a scientist who once studied the stars. They had nothing left but the will to defy extinction. The aliens could incinerate buildings, melt tanks, and silence entire populations, but there was something they could not calculate. They could not quantify the human refusal to accept annihilation. For the invaders, extermination was routine, a method executed countless times before. For humanity, survival was not strategy, it was instinct. Though the world lay in ruins, whispers grew louder among the scattered survivors. Somewhere in the devastation, people looked at the skies blazing with enemy ships and felt something sharper than fear. Hatred. Not the blind hatred of despair, but the cold, focused fury of a species cornered for the last time. If they were to die, it would not be as prey. And so, while cities still smoked and the oceans boiled, the first ember of defiance ignited in the ashes of Earth. It was not yet an army, not yet a movement. But it was enough. The aliens had come to kill, and they had succeeded beyond measure. Yet, without realizing it, they had also created something far deadlier than their weapons. They had awakened the human will to slaughter in return. In the hollowed-out skeletons of cities, in caverns carved beneath mountains, and in bunkers once meant for nuclear war, the remnants of humanity gathered. What had begun as chaos, screams, stampedes, desperate escapes, coalesced into a grim quiet. There was no government directing these assemblies, no polished speeches or flags. The people who remained came together because survival demanded it. They were farmers, truck drivers, hackers, pilots, and engineers. Soldiers without commanders, medics without hospitals, children without schools. Stripped of every comfort, they shared one thing, the conviction that surrender meant extinction, and extinction was intolerable. The aliens saw them as broken. Surveillance drones recorded clusters of survivors huddling around fires, scavenging scraps of food, patching wounds with torn clothing. The invaders dismissed them as weak animals prolonging the inevitable. Their arrogance was humanity's first weapon. They hunted systematically, deploying patrols meant to flush out resistance, but they expected no more than panic and flight. Instead, they encountered something different. The first strike was almost laughably simple, a patrol of alien soldiers ambushed on a highway bridge. Survivors had wired old gasoline trucks with crude explosives and lured the enemy into range before detonating the charges. The blast hurled alien forms into the air, their armor cracked and burned. For the first time since the invasion, alien blood stained the ground. A handful of humans had turned desperation into a weapon, and word of their success traveled faster than any official broadcast could have. More followed. A group of miners rigged tunnels to collapse on advancing units, burying them in tons of stone. A cluster of university students, armed with laptops and stolen radio gear, jammed enemy frequencies long enough for a convoy of refugees to escape. Hunters in the forests of Eastern Europe lured patrols into wooded traps, using rifles older than their grandfathers to fell soldiers who had marched across galaxies. Each act was small, but each resonated with the same message: humans could fight back. Alien commanders began to take notice. Their reports shifted in tone, describing the resistance not as disorganized survivors but as irritants capable of delaying operations. They underestimated still, failing to see the momentum building behind every act of defiance. The more they tightened their grip, the more cunning the resistance became. Humans could not match their energy weapons or shields, but they could exploit familiarity with terrain. Bombardments left ruins that became fortresses. Sewers became arteries of movement. Mountains became natural ambush points. The very devastation the aliens wrought created the battlefield humans needed. Fear no longer drove the survivors. Anger did. They were not just fighting for life but for vengeance. Every fallen parent, every charred child, every destroyed home fed a fury that sharpened into strategy. Resistance cells learned quickly, exchanging knowledge through stolen radios, encrypted signals, and word of mouth carried across hundreds of miles. Techniques spread: how to aim at the joints in alien armor, how to bait drones into crossfire, how to dismantle unexploded munitions for makeshift mines. Aliens were in use to prey that learned. On every other world they had purged, the victims either submitted or perished in chaos. Humanity refused both paths. Each failed extermination attempt taught the survivors something new. Every patrol lost increased alien caution, slowed their advance, and created more time for humans to prepare the next strike. By the time alien strategists realized they were fighting not vermin but hunters, the resistance had spread across continents. The psychological war began to turn. For the first time, alien soldiers hesitated. Patrols advanced more slowly, double-checking shadows and alleys. They heard the echo of sniper fire from unseen rooftops, the whistle of arrows tipped with scavenged explosives, the crunch of traps hidden beneath rubble. Fear, foreign to their kind, began to creep into their movements. They had come to Earth expecting a clean cull. Instead, they found themselves stalked in every ruin, hunted in every darkened street. Humans fed on this hesitation. Victories, however small, were magnified by the knowledge that the enemy could bleed and could falter. The idea spread through the resistance like wildfire. The invaders were not gods, not immortal executioners. They were vulnerable, and vulnerability was all humanity needed. Around underground fires, survivors whispered new names for themselves, not refugees, not victims, but fighters. They carried crude weapons, alien rifles scavenged from fallen patrols, and sharpened steel forged in workshops powered by bicycle generators. Each person understood they might die tomorrow, but they also understood that their deaths could carve another wound into the enemy. In that knowledge, they found purpose greater than survival. What began as scattered sparks became a blaze stretching across continents. No leader commanded it, no nation guided it, yet it grew with unstoppable rhythm. Humanity was adapting, faster than any alien doctrine could predict. And as the invaders recalibrated their strategies, the truth was already forming in their reports, whispered in tones of disbelief. These humans did not merely resist extermination. They resisted with a ferocity that threatened to turn the slaughter back on those who had come to deliver it. The early strikes of resistance proved something vital: the enemy could bleed. That knowledge hardened into discipline, and discipline turned into evolution. Humanity, once scattered, began to grow teeth sharper than anyone had imagined. Every skirmish provided lessons, and every corpse, alien or human, became a teacher. Survivors no longer fought only with rifles or explosives but with ingenuity, weaving the scraps of a broken world into weapons the enemy had never faced before. Technicians scavenged fragments of alien armor, prying open circuits designed to withstand the vacuum of space. They did not fully understand the science, but that had never stopped humans before. Reverse-engineered fragments became crude energy rifles, unstable but devastating at close range. Mechanics grafted alien power cells onto drones and tanks, creating hybrid war machines that spat fire beyond their intended capacity. Laboratories hidden in basements and caves worked with scavenged components, welding together weapons that mixed Earth's gunpowder grit with stolen extraterrestrial brilliance. Cunning went beyond technology. Farmers who once built irrigation lines dug elaborate traps disguised as collapsed ruins, luring enemies into choke points where resistance fighters rained death from above. Chemists brewed improvised toxins from industrial waste, substances that clung to alien armor and corroded with frightening speed. Biologists studying captured specimens learned where their exoskeletal plating was weakest, mapping precise angles for a blade or bullet to pierce. It was not organized by governments or funded by nations. It was the collective genius of a species that had always thrived by bending the world to its will. With each adaptation came a cost. Families were torn apart not only by alien strikes but by the choices humans had to make. Parents left children in bunkers to join sabotage teams, knowing they might never return. Communities rationed food to fighters while elders starved quietly, unwilling to drain precious supplies. Grief became a constant companion, but it hardened rather than broke the survivors. Every death was translated into action, every loss into a sharper edge of vengeance. The battles began to shift from desperation to methodical assault. Fighters coordinated across entire regions, sharing tactics through jury-rigged networks powered by car batteries and solar panels scavenged from rooftops. A resistance strike in one city would trigger another hundreds of miles away, overwhelming alien patrols spread thin by the need to respond everywhere at once. The once invincible invaders discovered that they were not facing scattered prey but a species learning to fight as a single organism. Their arrogance continued to work against them. Alien Command underestimated how quickly humans adapted, expecting resistance to collapse after each crushing reprisal. Instead, reprisals only spread fury further. Each destroyed village inspired 3 more cells to rise. Each massacre carved another scar that turned ordinary people into soldiers. The invaders had never faced such relentless escalation. Their manuals prepared them for fear, not fury. They were unprepared for enemies who grew stronger with every strike against them. As victories accumulated, the identity of the invaders shifted in human minds. They were no longer untouchable gods of fire but prey caught in unfamiliar terrain. Survivors began to refer to them with names spat like curses. Metal shells, ash burners, the hollow. Jokes emerged, bitter but energizing, mocking the enemies who stumbled into traps laid by farmers with nothing but rope and dynamite. Mockery bred confidence, and confidence bred bolder operations. Entire regions began slipping from alien control. Dense jungles became fortresses where patrols dared not tread. Frozen wastelands concealed hunter teams that struck and vanished into snowdrifts. Desert communities transformed shifting sands into traps that swallowed machines whole. Every climate, every landscape, every ruin became a weapon turned against the invaders. Earth itself seemed to fight for its children. It was in these crucibles of adaptation that the aliens coined their most damning name for humanity, Deathwielders. They realized, too late, that this planet was not merely a cradle of fragile life but a forge of predators honed by endless struggle. The beings they had sought to erase were not vermin but apex survivors, creatures who did not yield even when broken. What was meant to be a routine extermination became a war of attrition that gnawed at alien morale as surely as it devoured their ranks. And still, the humans pressed on. They did not have fleets, but they stole ships. They did not have factories, but they built forges and caves. They did not have peace, but they had will. Every scrap of knowledge pulled from the enemy was absorbed and twisted into something lethal. What had begun as scattered defiance now evolved into a campaign that promised not only survival but dominance. The slaughter was far from over, but for the first time, the outcome no longer seemed certain. The momentum of resistance no longer looked like survival but conquest. What began as scattered sabotage hardened into a campaign of precision. Guerrilla cells that once struck opportunistically now coordinated across borders, striking in concert like parts of a single organism. Where one strike erupted in the jungles of South America, another followed hours later in the ruins of Eastern Europe, and still another in the deserts of Africa. Each blow forced the invaders to spread thinner, their overwhelming numbers now strained by the constant demand to respond everywhere at once. For the first time, humans dictated the pace of war. Alien commanders accustomed to swift exterminations found themselves reacting rather than leading. Their fleets in orbit, once untouchable symbols of dominance, began to suffer humiliations. Resistance hackers infiltrated their systems through captured devices, disrupting orbital bombardments and causing ships to fire upon their own formations. Old human satellites, long abandoned in the void, were reactivated and armed with jury-rigged payloads, turning derelict machinery into weapons raining fire back on those who had once controlled the skies. On the ground, entire landscapes shifted under human control. City ruins that aliens had scorched became killing fields designed to swallow them whole. Skyscrapers, gutted by bombardments, were converted into sniper nests. Bridges were mined, sewers became ambush tunnels, and highways turned into traps that collapsed beneath the weight of alien vehicles. Fighters learned to move like shadows, striking with precision, then melting away before reinforcements could arrive. The enemy's superior technology was reduced to impotence against the unpredictability of human creativity. Alien soldiers began to feel the erosion of their confidence. They marched with caution now, weapons at the ready in every alley, every tree-line, every abandoned street. But vigilance could not undo the fear gnawing at their ranks. Stories spread of entire patrols vanishing into forests, of armored convoys swallowed by mines, of command outposts overrun in the dead of night with nothing left but silence and blood. The invaders who had once inspired dread now carried it within themselves. Their fleets fared no better. When humans captured their first operational vessel, it was thought a miracle. When they captured the second, it was strategy. Teams of engineers and scavengers pored over alien craft, reconfiguring systems with reckless brilliance. Soon, those stolen ships were turned back upon their makers, spearheading raids that struck orbital supply chains and disabled communications between fleets. What had once been invincible became vulnerable, hunted even in the void above Earth. These victories did more than weaken the enemy. They unified humanity beyond anything history had known. Old borders, rivalries, and grudges dissolved in the face of a common purpose. No one spoke of nations anymore. There were only humans, bound together by the will to erase the invaders who had sought to erase them. The language of the battlefield was universal. A gun passed from one fighter's hands to another, a ration shared between strangers, a coded signal that carried across continents. Unity became the sharpest weapon of all. Alien commanders tried escalation, deploying heavier firepower and harsher reprisals. But their brutality only hardened resistance further. Where they leveled villages, survivors formed larger cells. Where they unleashed new weapons, humans adapted faster than before. Every escalation closed the gap between predator and prey until the distinction blurred. The invaders had misjudged Earth. They were learning too late that their campaign had forged their enemies into something greater than they had ever faced. By the time humanity launched its first coordinated counteroffensive, the war had already turned. Multiple resistance armies rose simultaneously, converging on key strongholds across continents. They moved with precision, not as scattered fighters but as armies born from the ashes of billions. Hybrid weapons thundered alongside old artillery. Stolen ships unleashed fire from orbit while ground teams advanced through the smoke. For the first time, it was not the aliens who slaughtered with impunity but humans who cut through their ranks with relentless purpose. When the first major alien fleet fell to a combined strike of human ingenuity and stolen power, it sent a shockwave through the galaxy. For the invaders, it was not merely a defeat but an unraveling of certainty. They had never known failure, never imagined that prey could rise and hunt them in return. Yet here, on a world they had dismissed as weak, their superiority shattered. Humanity had not only survived the onslaught, they had seized the initiative, and the tide was turning irreversibly. The final phase of the war was no longer survival but judgment. Humanity had clawed its way from the edge of extinction to the edge of supremacy, and now the question was no longer whether they would live but how they would end those who had come to erase them. The enemy still held vast resources, but their confidence was shattered, and fractured command left their fleets vulnerable. Humans seized upon every weakness, striking relentlessly until the invaders found themselves fighting a war they could not sustain. Infiltration became the chosen method for the last great push. Teams of specialists, drawn from every corner of Earth, slipped into enemy command structures through stolen vessels and disguised signals. They brought with them weapons not of overwhelming force but of devastating precision, viruses coded to corrupt alien systems, bombs hidden within stolen supply crates, misinformation fed directly into their networks. The aliens, once masters of control, found their coordination unraveling as ships fired upon allies and orders contradicted themselves. On Earth, armies of survivors advanced with the confidence of predators. They no longer struck and vanished but pressed forward, clearing territories that had been under occupation since the first days of invasion. Fields once charred by bombardments became staging grounds for counterstrikes, and the ruins of cities transformed into symbols of reclamation. Where invaders once walked freely, they now cowered behind fortifications that grew weaker by the day. Each human advance was not just tactical but symbolic, proof that the exterminators had lost the power to dictate terms. The climax came when humanity targeted the heart of the alien campaign, the central fleet in orbit, the command hub that coordinated every operation across the planet. Using captured ships as a wedge, humans launched a strike that combined their most daring ingenuity with unshakable resolve. Electronic warfare blinded defenses, improvised cannons ripped through hulls, and boarding teams cut their way into corridors to plant charges at critical points. The battle was brutal, but the result was undeniable. The command fleet, once the invincible overseer of extermination, erupted into fire that lit Earth's skies for days. From that moment, the war shifted irrevocably. The remaining alien forces broke into fragments, retreating from strongholds or attempting to regroup in the void. Humanity allowed no reprieve. Pursuit was merciless. Resistance fighters who had once hidden underground now stood in the open, armed with scavenged weapons and the confidence of victors. Every retreating patrol was hunted, every outpost dismantled, every vessel forced to flee under fire. The extermination had reversed direction. Captured transmissions revealed the invaders' disbelief. They had expected submission or extinction, never reversal. To them, humanity's response was not only militarily impossible but philosophically incomprehensible. They had never faced an enemy that grew more dangerous the closer it came to destruction. The words repeated across their fractured networks betrayed fear. The humans were not prey, not vermin, but a force that turned annihilation into evolution. For the first time in their long history of purges, they were the ones being slaughtered. The final exterminations were carried out with a coldness that surprised even the victors. There was no mercy, no offers of surrender. The memory of burned cities, massacred families, and poisoned lands had left no space for negotiation. Humanity's answer to attempted eradication was absolute retribution. Ships fleeing orbit were hunted down and destroyed. Ground forces that tried to surrender found themselves met not with captivity but execution. The message was clear: those who had come to erase humanity would themselves be erased. When the last major alien presence was extinguished, Earth was left scarred but unbroken. Forests still smoldered, oceans still bore the stains of battle, and billions had been lost. Yet beneath the ash, life endured. Communities emerged from bunkers to rebuild, not under the banners of nations but under a single understanding forged in blood: humanity had survived because they had stood as one. Old divisions seemed petty now in the shadow of what they had defeated. In the wider galaxy, the echoes of Earth's victory spread faster than any fleet could travel. The species once dismissed as fragile primitives now carried a reputation carved into the memories of their enemies. They were the Deathworlders, the predators who had turned back extermination with nothing but will, fury, and endless ingenuity. To allies they might one day meet, the story was one of hope. To enemies, it was a warning. The invaders had come to kill humanity, certain of their superiority. Instead, they had awakened a force they could neither understand nor withstand. Humanity had not only survived, they had slaughtered those who sought their end. And in doing so, they proved a truth that would echo across the stars: there is nothing more dangerous than a human with nothing left to lose.